Is this mic on? Okay. Well, I just want to start by thanking REAP for inviting me to speak. It's really a great honor to be invited back to my home state and be able to talk about something that I'm really passionate about. And it's also a great honor to be presenting alongside ORPC. They're really a global leader in this industry, and I'm really excited to hear what they have to say as well. This is a photo taken this summer for the commissioning of the ORPC RibGen device in Igiugig, Alaska, and that's another event that I'm really honored that I was invited to be a part of. It was supported in large part, to a large degree, by the U.S. Department of Energy, but the work was really done by ORPC in the community of Igiugig, and I have to say that I had a relatively small part to play in it, but I was really grateful to be invited and be a part of their event. So I wanted to start by taking a step back. The U.S. Department of Energy's Marine Energy Program is housed within the Water Power Technologies Office, which is a part of the Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy Office. And so the Marine Energy Program, it sees itself as having a domain over wave energy, tidal energy, river sort of in-stream hydrokinetic energy, the Igiugig project being an example of that, and then also ocean current energy, which is off the coast of Florida and Georgia. And the exact numbers, the values on this slide are not really important. The point is that there's a lot of energy. The U.S. has a large marine energy resource, but even more importantly for this talk, Alaska has an outsized proportion of that resource. We have 50% of the nation's wave energy resource, we have 90% of the nation's tidal energy resource, and we've got 20% of this in-stream river resource. And in addition, Cook Inlet, Alaska is the #1 site in the nation for tidal energy. I think kind of on any metric that you look at these sorts of things, Cook Inlet really stands out as a promising location for harnessing tidal energy, and so I think it's a really exciting thing, and I'm really excited to be here to talk to you about it today. So, since I was invited to talk about tidal energy, I thought I'd start by talking about wave energy. And I just wanted to give you sort of this picture. These are a bunch of different wave energy devices that are sort of being actively developed or have been developed. Here on the far left is the Resolute Marine Energy device. This is basically a flapping device that sits on the seafloor and flaps back and forth as the waves go by and harnesses energy. They've partnered with Yakutat in the past. This buoy, the OPT power buoy, it basically bobs up and down and generates power that way. This is the Pelamis device. This is a European device. It's sort of a snake that sits on the ocean surface, and by the relative motion of sort of the different pieces of the snake, it generates electricity. The M3 wave device sits on the bottom, and there's sort of a pressure differential from one side of the wave to the other, and it drives fluid flow through this pipe, and there's a little turbine in this pipe that generates electricity. And then this wave dragon device, the idea is I sort of cropped this photo to fit it in with all these other ones, but it's got these big arms that stick out like this, and it sort of tries to catch the waves, and they're funneled into the middle here, and then they sort of crash over the top of this barrier, and the water is caught in a basin, and then there's the pressure differential, so that basin is then higher, has a higher water level than the ocean around it, and so that drives a flow through a turbine. And the thing you might notice about this is that there's really a bunch of different concepts going on for how to generate electricity from waves. And the way that the industry sort of talks about that is that there hasn't been convergence on like some fundamental basic device types in wave energy, and that means that they see that as to the technology's relatively new. It's a more emerging technology than, for example, wind energy, which has converged on sort of an upwind, three-bladed rotor that we're all familiar with. So if we compare that to tidal energy, I think you're starting to see things that you're a little more familiar with. And here I've just got a picture of 3 different devices. Of course, the ORPC device, I don't want to steal too much of Nate's thunder here, but this is their rib-gen device getting ready to go in the water in Igiagig this last summer. This is what we call a cross-flow device, so the turbines are oriented sort of crossways to the inflow. And then this is another U.S. company, Verdant Power. They have a project they're planning to deploy in the East River of New York. In the spring of 2020, they'll be deploying a similar device to this. And then on the far right, I've shown a picture of a somewhat larger turbine. This is I believe this is the Andritz Hydro tidal energy device. So this is a 1.5 megawatt device, and it was deployed in Scotland in the Pentland Firth. And so this device is 1.5 megawatts. That's comparable to the scale of the wind turbines that you see on Fire Island and so on and so forth. So, in some sense, the Europeans, some might say the Europeans are ahead of us in this sector in terms of the size of their devices. But I like to think that we've got some really good tech here back in the U.S. as well. But the point is that these turbines are things that we're familiar with. The technology is being demonstrated at scales that are meaningful and relevant, and they're generating significant amounts of power. And I think where we're at now is we're demonstrating that these technologies can be reliable for longer periods of time than just a few days or a few weeks. We want to show, we're at the point now where we're demonstrating that these technologies can produce power consistently for years at a time. And that's fundamentally different than wave energy, and that's sort of important for some of the discussions we'll be having later on, or I'll be having later on. So where are we at with tidal energy? This is a plot that shows the cost of wind energy between 1982 and 2012, so it's a 30-year period. And I basically think that we're at the far left end of this curve for tidal energy. The costs are still relatively high for these devices. We still are just making one-off devices or just a couple at a time. And I think what happened in the wind energy industry is that in order to come down to these low costs to where we're actually competitive with other forms, sort of conventional forms of electricity generation, is we had to scale up. It's basically economies of scale brought the costs of wind energy down. And in the case of wind, it was largely driven by incentives by the state of California and some federal incentives that really provided the capital to install a bunch of devices, break things, try it out, and eventually, OEMs like Siemens and GE stepped in and started buying the technologies that were successful, and they commercialized them and were able to make them into products that we're seeing today are competitive with traditional forms of generation. And I'm often inspired by what I see in the wind energy industry. I work at the National Wind Technology Center in Boulder, Colorado, and they often talk about how back in these days, everyone thought they were crazy. Are we really going to be able to pull this off? Are we ever going to make significant amounts of power? Are we going to be able to offset the power that we're burning when we drive to work every day? And now you look, and GE has recently announced a 12 megawatt offshore wind turbine. I think it's like 180 meters tall. It's almost 2 football fields tall, and
it's just really inspiring, and I'd like to think that we can do something similar in tidal energy and wave energy. And so incentives and those, tax incentives and subsidies and those sorts of things, I think, are things that we should talk about and can certainly help. But the Department of Energy has also been sort of trying to think out of the box a little bit about other ways that we can get the experience that we need with these technologies to push the industry forward. And so they've sort of launched this initiative called Powering the Blue Economy. And the blue economy is basically everything that happens in the ocean. And so there's all these statistics up here about how fast the blue economy is expected to grow in the next 10 years and these sorts of things. But I really want to draw your attention to this slide over here on your right. And the biggest thing that I want to draw your attention to is that they have this resilient coastal communities component of their Powering the Blue Economy initiative. And this is like the hottest topic at the DOE Water Power Technologies office right now. And in particular, I've been having meetings with people about this resilient coastal communities and how do we engage with these communities and who are they and how are we gonna effectively engage with these communities so that we can both advance our technologies but also meet the needs of the communities that we're working with. And I probably don't need to tell anybody in this room that Alaska has a lot of these kinds of communities that are experiencing high energy costs. And so, DOE sees these high energy costs and they say, oh, maybe that's a market where, our expensive technologies can step in and actually compete or bring the costs of energy down in these markets at the same time as we're getting those iterations that we need in developing our technologies. And so, the thing that's interesting about, the thing that's remarkable about this plot is that, so the red dots are communities that have costs of power that is above 50 cents a kilowatt hour. And this information is a little bit out of date. It's 2013 data from the Alaska Energy Authority's PCE report. But I think the picture is basically still the same. A lot of these communities around Alaska have high energy costs, and the other thing that you'll notice is that a lot of these communities are located on the coast or they're located on rivers. And so I think these are the types of communities that DOE, I know these are the types of communities that DOE is thinking about right now and talking about targeting as a part of this PBE initiative. Just really quick, a few of the communities that have sort of already been a part of DOE's program. Yakutat, as I mentioned earlier, had been working with Resolute Marine Energy, and Scott's in the room. Good to have him here. He was a part of that work. That was a wave energy project. Oh, the other thing I should say is this green is the wave energy resource. And so this dark green you'll see is sort of down along the Panhandle and then also along the Aleutians is where the energy is most intense. And so that's why, in addition to the technology not being quite ready in the wave energy sector, the wave energy is also not concentrated where the population centers are in the state as well. So wave energy is not quite the same opportunity, in my opinion, as riverine and tidal energy is. But in Yakutat, it's really an exciting opportunity. Igiagig, Nate, I don't want to steal his thunder too much, but they've really been a thought leader in the space of really pushing the envelope and being willing to take the risk of working with these emerging technologies, and they've been absolutely phenomenal to work with, and I'm sure Nate would say the same. And then False Pass is another site. This is a tidal energy site in this case. So Igiagig is a river site at the headwaters of the Kvichak River. False Pass is a tidal energy site. It's actually the first waterway through the Aleutian Peninsula, so it's right at the end of the Alaska Peninsula, and it's a really promising tidal energy site. Yeah, and then last, Cook Inlet. This, again, is the #1 tidal energy site in the country. It not only, so Alaska, I said earlier, has 90% of the tidal energy resource in the nation. Cook Inlet has half of it. of the nation's tidal, almost half of it. Cook Inlet has half of the 90%, so it's nearly half of the nation's tidal energy resources right here. And the remarkable thing about that is for a lot of these other tidal hotspots, you might call them, these little spots that pop up with this bright blue color around Alaska, the population centers are relatively small in these locations, but Cook Inlet is right here. It's right where all the people live. It's right where the energy is needed most. And so in my mind, this is, the fact that we have the resource located here right next to all the people, it makes it a really remarkable opportunity. There's, theoretically, you could harness something like 18 gigawatts of power, which is almost 20 times the load of the entire rail belt. And so you could build a project that was some small fraction of the block, some small fraction of this channel, and you could generate hundreds of megawatts of power. And tidal energy isn't always there. It's going to oscillate, as we all know, throughout the day. But if you couple that with some of the existing storage projects that we have in the state, such as Bradley, and I was talking to Mike earlier about a battery storage project that's going to be coming online. You start to think about the state of Alaska approaching renewables of like 80. You could start to have a conversation of Alaska approaching 80 or 90 or 100% renewable. And I just think that's remarkable in a state that has traditionally been an oil-based state. And it reminds me of Norway. Norway is a country that, they took all their oil wealth and created a renewable energy system. And there's something like, 90 or 100, something 80 or 90% renewable. And we could do that here in Alaska, and we could do it with tidal energy, and we could export that knowledge and the technologies that we develop here to the rest of the world that's looking for, that need this technology and that have tidal energy resources. I think that's really exciting. I would love to be a part of making that happen. And I've been working, I've been at NREL now for 8 years. And throughout my time there, me and some of my colleagues, my mentors, have targeted Alaska, and we've said, look, this is where the resource is. It all fits together. We've got the small communities where you could do some of the early projects, and I've been working to sort of get this message to DOE that Alaska is the place that we should be doing this, and they're finally starting to listen. And I think we have a really great opportunity here. So now I just want to talk briefly about some of the work that we'll be doing to sort of, we're getting started on moving this forward at the national labs. I don't know if you can see this very well, but this is supposed to be the forelands of Cook Inlet. And so this is, if I were to draw this box, it would be right here. And in this case, I'm plotting the tidal power density. So the dark spots are where the currents are the strongest, is where there's the most energy. In this case, I'm plotting the bathymetry, and so you're seeing a deep channel here, but there's a somewhat smaller channel here, and if we look here right off of the east foreland, there's this really intense sort of tide rip that exists there. There's a lot of energy right there. And so because that's right next to Nikiski, it's right next to the grid, this is sort of where we're focusing our efforts first. And so this is sort of a transect across that site. The colors here in these bars indicate, based on models, what we expect the most energetic sites to be. And so most of the energy is concentrated here. And so we're going to be putting these instruments in the water to measure the currents. We're going to be measuring the turbulence in the water, which is actually really important. In the early days of wind, they didn't account for turbulence in the wind in their designs, and all their turbines broke. And they just kept breaking turbines, and they couldn't figure out why. They're like, well, the wind speed is 20 meters a second. Why do our turbines keep breaking? And it's really the You know, when you're riding on an airplane and you hit turbulence, you know how jarring that is, and maybe you have similar nightmares as me when you're experiencing that. And so the turbulence does that to wind turbines as well. And so that was actually one of the big reasons that I was originally hired, was my background in oceanography was in turbulence. And so measuring the turbulence is a big piece of what we do and what my specific interest area was when I started out here. But my role is growing and my team is growing. And so we're going to be measuring currents, we're going to be measuring turbulence, we're also going to be measuring sediment. We think that's going to be really important in Cook Inlet. Obviously, these are glacially fed. It's a glacially fed inlet, and those fine-grained sediments, figuring out how to deal with those when you've got bearings and seals and those sorts of things is going to be, I think, a challenge at this site. We're also going to be measuring salinity and temperature and so on. This is a plot that just shows some of the data that we get, the turbulence. So this top plot just shows the tidal amplitude. This second plot shows the currents. This is from, oh, I meant to say, we're going to be making these measurements in the spring of next year. In April of 2020, we're going to be going out and we're going to be putting 3 moorings at these 3 sites. We're also going to be making transects back and forth across the site to measure the flow and sort of try to capture that spatial variability at this site. So I'm really excited to be doing that work, and we're partnering with ORPC, and Terrasond here in Alaska is going to be helping us a bunch with that work, as well as we're working with the RV Peregrine out of Homer. Is going to be the ship that we're on. So I'm really excited about this work. So these are the currents. This is the turbulence that we've seen at other sites. So this is just an example of the kind of data that we get. I said enough about that. The other thing I wanted to say is frequently when I talk about tidal energy, people will ask me, well, are you going to kill all the fish? You know, aren't those things just sushi makers? Or what about, you know, and I think in Alaska, in Cook Inlet in particular, the beluga whales are a real concern. And so this was work that was done at the Pacific Northwest National Lab. So this is another one of your national labs that's working in this sector. And they've done a lot of work, and you know, to cut to the chase on this is that a lot of these types of concerns, I think, are going to end up not being big issues. What they've found so far is that fish tend to avoid turbines. We haven't had a scenario yet where a whale is encountering one of these devices, to my knowledge, but they've done some really interesting work where they've like taken blubber from a whale and they've sort of modeled the structural strength of a whale's, I think in this case they were looking at a killer whale, but the strength of its bone and its head and so on, and then they said, oh, let's try to simulate what if you whacked this thing with one of these tidal turbine blades, and they found that it's not going to, most likely it's not going to break the surface. It's going to give the whale a headache, maybe, but it's not going to do significant damage. And you know, so I think there's more work to be done in terms of in this space, certainly. And we want, but the point is that we're looking at it. We're trying to be proactive about this. But all of the research so far indicates that these things are really, I think, not concerns. And they're doing really great work at PNNL. Lastly, so sort of bookending my talk here, starting with wave energy, ending with wave energy. This is a wave energy, sorry, not a wave energy buoy. This is a wave measurement buoy. So this buoy is just measuring the waves in the Gulf of Alaska off of Kodiak. This is just more examples of the kind of work that we're doing to get a better picture of the marine energy resource that Alaska has. The east and west coast of the U.S. is sort of littered with these buoys. There's lots of data. The Gulf of Alaska is relatively sparse in terms of wave measurement buoys, and so we're trying to add to that and get a better picture so that we can validate our models better and just really understand what the resource is. So I wanted to close with this slide because I think it really emphasizes the opportunity that we have here. You know, DOE, like I said earlier, DOE is really shifting, I shouldn't say shifting their focus, but they have this new initiative that is a big topic at the Department of Energy, and especially this remote communities, resilient communities. How are we gonna partner with remote communities to advance our technologies and also hopefully help these remote communities? And I think Alaska has the communities that they're looking for. And I think one of the big questions that's been coming up in this space lately is, what's the right time to engage with these communities versus in terms of, you don't want to go talk to the community too early before you have something that you're ready to bring them, because they'll just be like, well, why are you wasting my time? I want to get back to fishing. On the other hand, you want to engage with them early enough that you can build the right kind of relationship and build the trust that you need to see these types of projects through to the end. And that's a big kind of question that we have right now. And I think ORPC has really been a model for how to do this in their work in Igiugig and False Pass. And my argument has been that we should really be identifying a relatively small set of communities early on to work with that are interested in, that are willing to sort of be the guinea pig. But in general, we shouldn't kind of be launching a big initiative before we've demonstrated our technologies a little bit more in this tidal and river energy space. We want to know that these devices, we want to be able to say, we've run these devices for 2, 3, 5 years and know that they're really working. But more importantly, that's just my opinion, and I'm interested to know what your thoughts are on this. I want to know what you guys think about Cook Inlet and the prospects there. What do the utilities need to know about the resource and about what the output profile of these technologies is going to be? I feel like I've done all I can. I shouldn't say I've done all I can, but I've done as much as I can to get Alaska on the radar of DOE. And it's sort of on all of us together now to capitalize on that opportunity and figure out how to make the most of it. So that's pretty much all I have to say, and thank you for your time.
What we ran up against was the 50-ton icebergs that are neutrally buoyant that break loose at high tide after accumulating sediment in the intertidal zone. That would crush just about anything you could put out there. And in Igiugig, they take it out in the winter. So you really are not only on the high end of the renewable energy scale, but you're now twice as expensive because you can only amortize it for half of the year. So I'm sort of wondering just how far down the inlet you have to go to avoid the neutrally buoyant icebergs so that we could actually put something in the water. And unfortunately, the current isn't strong enough near the mouth of the inlet. Once you get south of the forelands, your current drops off considerably. And so do we really have any opportunity to field something that can work year long and not get clogged by ice or clobbered by ice?
So I've heard rumors about this submerged ice problem that's impregnated with sediments, but I've searched the literature and I haven't found anything that definitively shows that it's there. And I'm not saying it's not there, but I'm really excited because these devices will see it. We're going to see it if it's there. And so I'm really excited to have some data that's going to maybe shed a little bit more light on this question of, we're going to have these are going to be in the water for 2 months. We're going to be at 3 different sites. And I hope we don't see it, to be completely honest. But if we do see it, I think it'll be really interesting, and how frequently it's seen, how big they are, starting to actually answer some of those questions is something that I'm really excited about doing with this project. Yeah.
I noticed in some of your slides, the map slides, that there wasn't a lot of detail in terms of tidal energy potential for Southeast Alaska. Is that because there isn't enough natural tidal energy, or was it just not thoroughly investigated, or?
Southeast Alaska and the Aleutian chain both have significant tidal energy. It just doesn't show up on this scale. You know, they tend to be these little hot spots that between the squeeze points of channels and things like that. And you know, Cook Inlet shows up at this scale a little bit. You know, you can see the dark blue spots here, but that's because it's so big. But there is significant tidal energy potential both in Southeast Alaska and along the Aleutian chain.
Thanks, this is really informative, and I'm glad to see you're thinking about it ahead of time, how to involve the villages. And I think one way to come in earlier and that will benefit the project is to come in and say, what do we need to be aware of? What's the local knowledge? What are those things that you see might be challenging that we may not? And I think that's important for both sides.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, you asked for the utility perspective. There's submarine cables that currently cross the inlet outside of the very high current zones, and there's been some interesting experiences with those, you know, where the cable's almost been knotted up, and changing topography of the bottom of the inlet has also been problematic. And I'm just trying to imagine in a higher current area where it's neck down, how much that profile will change, and what's, you know, outside of neutral density ice, what sort of challenges that'll present from getting the power from the turbine back to the infrastructure on land.
Yeah, I mean, I guess my perspective is that I'm not trying to say there aren't going to be challenges with doing this, but I think that Alaskans, they pride themselves on their self-sufficiency and their sort of practical problem-solving skills, and you know, things like how to get a cable out to these types of sites. You know, obviously there's all sorts of horizontal drilling technologies, those sorts of things. You know, I mean, the other practical problems that I think about, the sediments, you know, how do you design a better bearing or a better seal? Those sorts of challenges, they're real. And, you know, I mean, I think there's jobs there too, in terms of like launching research initiatives to tackle these problems. And if we can tackle them, and if we can demonstrate that we can do these sorts of things, then that knowledge that we develop in this state can be exported to the rest of the world.
The Yakutat project, was that a tidal energy experimental project, or was that
a wave energy project?
That was wave energy.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm just curious as to, do you see one or the other of these types of tidal machines being better than the other one that's kind of pulling ahead, or are they all about at the same level of development right now?
I mean, they're not at the same level of development, but I think maybe it has more to do with the amount of capital that's been invested. You know, the Europeans have invested more in terms of capital than we have to date. You know, I think the horizontal axis turbine, let's see. Oh. So we call this a horizontal axis turbine, and this is a horizontal axis turbine because the flow sort of flows along the axis of the device. You know, that's the basic concept that's used in wind energy, and you know, these technologies are leveraging that knowledge basically. But you know, I mean, I think the cross-flow device has a lot of interesting advantages in terms of being able to sort of the robustness of being able to anchor it at multiple ends, as well as the aspect ratio, I think is really ideal for shallow river environments. You know, you've got this wide device you only have one generator. I don't know, I can't answer that question, I guess. It's a little early for that.
Are you folks working on the integration with the diesel plant part for villages? Or are you gonna like just go with what the wind turbine folks have come up with?
Yes and yes.
Okay, I'm just curious.
I mean, we definitely are trying to, the grid integration, microgrid integration of renewables is a huge challenge. It's one that I've been, you know, intermittently interested in, and I am still interested in. NREL has put a lot of, you know, put a lot of heads together on that. But I also think that's a case of, you know, Alaskans have been leading this charge in terms of figuring this out, because it's such an important issue for so many communities around the state, and it's at the you know, every community that tries to integrate renewables has to deal with that. And so that's a place where I sort of commend you all for your work in that space as much as NREL and other national labs that have been working on that problem.
Levi, there was a Tidal Energy workshop held in Ketchikan in 2007, and Verdant Power was the keynote speaker there. Trey Taylor, I think was the guy's name. I'm curious, it's interesting to me that Verdant Power has a similar machine in the same place 12 years later. Can you say anything about what's happened over that period of time? Did they disappear for a while, or they've just been making it better and better?
I don't know. As a lab, it's an uncomfortable question for me to answer, but yeah, I mean, they have been developing the design. I would say that there was a slow spot at DOE when the administration changed, basically, and there was lots of questions about funding, and I think that slowed things down for a little while.
So Levi, we have a resource that's gigawatts, right? And yet the machines that we have are kilowatts, maybe low megawatts. So what do you see as the bridge? How do we get there? Is it just demonstration projects and then scale it? How do you see us getting to the bigger scale?
I mean, I think that these types of innovative approaches, like the Powering the Blue Economy initiative, and just ways to get repetitions with deployment projects and test projects. And I think it also requires doing testing at labs, and I don't necessarily mean national labs, I mean universities and places where we can test components of the devices and make sure the device is robust enough before it goes in the water, so that when it goes in the water, you know, at maybe a megawatt scale, we're not trying that for the first time. But I guess I would just put this plot up here, and, you know, as a lab employee, I'm not really supposed to talk about policy, but I'll put this plot up here and point to these subsidies and incentives that helped commercialize wind.
Great, thank you, Levi. Yeah, give Levi a big hand, and hopefully we'll have a couple minutes.